My name is Bonnie Park, and the night I graduated high school was the night my life split in two before the suitcase, and after it. The football field behind Jefferson High was still glowing under floodlights, filled with laughter, camera flashes, and parents holding bouquets. Everyone was hugging, taking pictures, crying. Everyone except me. I stood a little apart, still wearing my blue gown, the diploma folded tight in my hand, the paper soft with sweat and heat. I thought we'd be going out for dinner, like other families. Instead, my dad led me to the parking lot, where the sound of celebration faded into the hum of distant cars. He opened the trunk, pulled out a scuffed tan suitcase with a cracked handle and an old airline sticker peeling from the side, and set it at my feet. "Find your own family," he said, voice flat, final. My sister Lena laughed under her breath, holding up her phone to film it. "Smile, Miss Independent," she mocked. The trunk slammed shut. My dad turned and walked away, the stadium lights reflecting off his jacket as if the world behind him still cared. I looked down at the suitcase. It wasn't luggage, it was a sentence, and the phone camera caught the moment my face stopped belonging anywhere. That night, I didn't just graduate from school. I was graduated from my family. Have you ever been told to make it on your own, like it was a gift? Tell me what city you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not the only one who started life standing alone in a parking lot with a suitcase no one packed. I grew up in a factory town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where every conversation smelled faintly of metal and oil. The air itself carried a low, constant hum, the heartbeat of the Midwest forge plant where my father worked as a foreman. Our town had one diner, two churches, and a main street that shut down by 8 p.m. on weeknights. Life revolved around the shifts at the plant. Men like my father wore their pride in their calloused hands and their silence. Women like my mother kept the books, balanced the bills, and made sure dinner was on the table by 6 sharp. Everything ran on schedule, predictable, efficient, unchanging, except, of course, how love was distributed in our house. At the Park family dinner table, there were always 4 wooden chairs and 1 foldable plastic one. That plastic chair was mine. It squeaked whenever I sat down, the sound sharp and hollow against the rhythm of forks and knives. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first, just an extra seat when I was younger. But over time, it stayed. The wooden chairs belonged to Mom, Dad, and Lena, my older sister, the golden child. She was the miracle everyone in town talked about. Bright, social, effortlessly likable. Teachers adored her, neighbors praised her, and my parents orbited around her like she was the Sunday. Everything Lena touched turned into a family headline. Everything I did quietly vanished before dessert. My father, Robert Park, had been a mechanic before becoming a foreman at Midwest Forge. He liked order, hierarchy, and rules. He believed life rewarded discipline and punished softness. When he looked at Lena, he saw promise. When he looked at me, he saw potential that made him uncomfortable, the kind of potential that didn't fit into his blueprint of what daughters were supposed to be. My mother, Diane, was softer in tone but sharper in judgment. She worked as an accountant for a small insurance office downtown and measured success in neat columns of numbers. Lena fit those columns perfectly. She made friends easily, volunteered at school events, and smiled in all the right ways. I was quieter, the kind of kid who took apart broken radios just to see what made them tick. While other girls in our neighborhood painted their nails or talked about homecoming, I spent hours in the garage surrounded by the smell of grease and solder. I liked the logic of machines. They didn't lie, didn't play favorites. If something didn't work, you could trace the failure and fix it. There was no guessing, no emotion, just cause and effect. My father sometimes watched me from the doorway, a beer in hand, his brow furrowed. "You're too much like the guys at work," he'd say, half proud, half dismissive. "But don't forget you're not one of them." Lena, meanwhile, floated effortlessly through high school. She was class treasurer, cheerleader, and host of every event that required a microphone. At home, Mom bragged about her like she was a stock performing above expectations. "Your sister just got invited to the leadership conference," she'd say at dinner. "Can you imagine? They only pick 5 students in the whole district." I'd nod, cutting my meatloaf into small pieces, pretending not to notice how no one asked what I'd done that week. My seat at the table always wobbled slightly, one leg uneven on the tile. Some nights, I wondered if the imbalance was built into the family itself. I learned early that attention in our house was a zero-sum game. If Lena was winning, I had to shrink. It became an instinct to speak softer, to move quieter, to not take up space that wasn't mine. I wasn't jealous exactly. I just wanted to be visible. But in our family, visibility was currency, and I was broke. One Saturday in my 10th grade, everything seemed like it might change. I'd entered the Ohio State Science Fair with a project I'd been working on for months, a robotic arm made entirely from recycled metal and spare servo motors I'd scavenged from broken printers. It could lift small objects, turn at the wrist, and respond to motion sensors, crude but functional. I stayed up late calibrating the servos until my eyes burned, fueled by instant noodles and hope. When the judges announced the winners, my name echoed through the gymnasium. First place Bonnie Park, for innovation in engineering design. The applause felt unreal. My science teacher, Mr. Harris, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've got a real future in this, Bonnie. Purdue has programs for kids like you." I smiled so wide it hurt. For the first time, I imagined bringing the trophy home and seeing pride flicker across my parents' faces. When I walked through the front door that evening, still wearing my medal, Lena was sitting on the couch, laughing over something on her phone. Mom was in the kitchen frosting a cake. "Guess what?" I said breathlessly. "I won. First place at the state fair. They said my project could qualify for national." Mom looked up from her mixing bowl, smiling absently. "That's cute, honey. But did you hear? Lena just got chosen to host the prom night this year. Isn't that incredible?" Lena squealed and twirled her hair, half listening. "They said I have the perfect voice for it," she said. Dad walked in from the garage, wiping his hands on a towel. "Good for you, sweetheart," he said, glancing at Lena. Then he turned to me, eyes landing briefly on the small metal trophy in my hand. "And you?" He paused, searching for words that never quite came. "Well, that's something. Keep it up." The conversation moved on before I could respond. Mom lit the candles on Lena's cake. They sang, laughed, cut slices. My medal clinked softly against my chest, but no one heard it. I took my piece of cake and went to eat in the garage, sitting on the cold concrete floor beside my half-finished prototypes. The robotic arm sat on the workbench, its metal fingers curled slightly as if waiting for a command. "I did it," I whispered to it, even if no one saw. "Alu." That night, I realized something quiet but sharp in our house. Love wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. You earned it by fitting the narrative, by shining the way they wanted you to. Lena's light was warm and easy to love. Mine, I guess, was too mechanical. Still, I couldn't stop tinkering. Machines made sense when people didn't. I saved scraps from the plant dumpster, built models, drew diagrams, and taught myself the basics of CAD on an old laptop from the school lab. My teacher let me stay late after class to practice. "You've got an engineer's brain," he told me. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But at home, there was no room for engineers, only daughters who behaved. Every time I spoke about college or projects, Dad's jaw tightened. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he'd say. "No one's paying you to play with junk." I started keeping my drawings hidden in a box under the bed, labeled spare parts. It was safer that way. The imbalance became the rhythm of our lives. Lena's accomplishments were loud, mine invisible. Family dinners turned into performances where I clapped at the right times, smiled in the right places, and ate quietly off my squeaky plastic chair. The one time I tried to trade it for a wooden one, Dad frowned. "That's your seat," he said. "Don't move it." I didn't. I just nodded, sat back down, and pretended not to notice how cold the plastic felt under my skin. Looking back now, that chair wasn't just furniture. It was a blueprint for the role I played in the family: temporary, collapsible, easy to fold away when not needed. If I close my eyes, I can still hear it creak. The letter arrived on a Thursday, the kind of gray, drizzling Ohio morning where the world looked half asleep. It came folded neatly in a cream envelope, the Purdue University seal embossed in gold at the top. I almost didn't open it right away. Part of me wanted to hold on to that moment of not knowing, to stretch it out like a fragile thread. For once, something in my life felt uncertain in a good way. I stood at the mailbox for a while, rain tapping the metal, my fingers shaking as I tore it open. "Dear Miss Park," it began. "We are pleased to inform you." The rest blurred as my vision swam. I read the words twice, 3 times: accepted, engineering program, partial scholarship. I pressed the letter to my chest, rain soaking through my jacket, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride, not borrowed from anyone else, not compared to anyone else, but my own. When I walked into the house that afternoon, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum, I imagined how it would go. Maybe Dad would smile. Maybe Mom would hug me. Maybe, just maybe, they'd see what I'd been working toward all along. Lena was at the dining table painting her nails, phone propped up beside her. Dad sat in his armchair, newspaper open, a half-empty coffee mug beside him. Mom was in the kitchen balancing the checkbook. "I got in," I said, breathless. Mom looked up, pen in hand. "Got in where?" "Purdue," I said, holding out the letter like an offering. "For engineering. They're giving me a scholarship." Lena's eyes flicked up from her phone, amused. "Engineering?" she repeated, as if it were a joke. Dad didn't even look up from his paper. "That's heavy work," he said. "Not for someone like you." I blinked. "What do you mean, someone like me?" He folded the newspaper slowly, setting it on his lap. "It's a man's field, Bonnie. You'll be out there with grease under your nails, lifting boxes, crawling under machines. You think you can handle that?" "I already do," I said quietly. "You've seen me in the garage." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're missing the point. Be realistic. You're not built for that kind of life." Mom added, almost gently. "Your grades are good enough for something stable. Maybe accounting like me. It's safer, cleaner, and you won't end up wasting money on something that doesn't suit you." I stared at them, my throat tightening. "It's not about money," I said. "It's about—" Dad cut me off with a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "Money is exactly what it's about. We can't afford your dreams, Bonnie. A partial scholarship isn't a free ride. Who's paying the rest? You?" The words hit harder than I expected. "I can work," I said. "I'll take shifts, find a job on campus." But he waved me off, already done with the conversation. "This family doesn't need another mouth chasing impossible things. We're not built for that. You want a degree? Fine. Find something practical, otherwise, don't expect us to fund your fantasies." I didn't realize I was crying until I saw a tear hit the letter. Mom noticed and frowned, not with sympathy, but with irritation. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "Your father's just trying to protect you. He knows how hard life gets." "No," I whispered. "He just doesn't believe I can do it." Dad stood, straightening his jacket. "House rules are simple," he said. "We don't raise dreamers here. Dreams don't pay the bills." That became his mantra. "This house doesn't raise dreamers." He said it when I stayed late in the garage, when I skipped parties to build models, when I drew blueprints on the backs of grocery receipts. Every time I reached for something beyond our fence, he'd pull me back down with those words. The next few days were quiet. Lena went on about her plans for senior prom, showing Mom fabric samples for her dress. Dad talked about a promotion at the plant. I existed somewhere in between, visible enough to fetch things, invisible enough to forget. One evening, Lena walked into my room uninvited, holding her phone like a mirror. "You're really serious about this, huh? Purdue? Engineering? All that?" "Yes," I said, still sketching lines for a new project. She leaned against the doorframe. "Why?" "It's not like anyone's going to care. You could build a rocket, and Dad would still say Lena smiled better for pictures." Her voice carried that soft cruelty. She'd mastered the kind that pretended to be sympathy. I didn't answer. She shrugged. "You could just do what Mom did. Marry stable, work part-time, keep life simple. That's what makes people proud around here, not blueprints." When she left, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I folded the Purdue letter back into its envelope and tucked it under my pillow. For a while, I stopped going to the garage. The tools gathered dust. Weeks passed, and every time the subject came up, Dad found a way to make it smaller. "You think you're smarter than everyone else?" he'd say. "You think you know better than the people paying your bills?" I learned to stop answering. By the time graduation season came around, the letter was still in my drawer, unopened again. I thought about declining the offer. What was the point if no one wanted me to go? But late one night, unable to sleep, I unfolded it again and read it by flashlight. My name looked different printed in that serif font: official, permanent, possible. It was proof that someone, somewhere, thought I belonged in a world bigger than this town. The next morning, as I left for school, I heard Dad in the kitchen talking to Mom. "She'll grow out of it," he said. "That dream stuff always burns out." And Mom, without missing a beat, replied, "I hope so." It's exhausting watching her chase wind. That sentence, chase wind, buried itself deep inside me. I didn't argue, didn't cry. I just smiled when they looked my way and said, "Okay, that." But something hardened quietly in me that day. It wasn't anger exactly, more like a decision. If love in this family came with conditions, I'd stop trying to meet them. The day I sent my acceptance reply to Purdue, I didn't tell anyone. I just dropped the letter in the mailbox and walked away, the metal door clanging shut behind me. It felt like a secret rebellion, small, silent, but real. I knew the costs would be mine to bear: the tuition, the rent, the disappointment. But I also knew something else. I'd rather carry the weight of my dreams than the lightness of their approval. When I got home that evening, Lena was showing Mom her new prom dress, sequins catching the sunset through the window. Dad sat on the couch, proud smile on his face. No one looked up when I entered. I slipped the Purdue letter from my pocket one last time, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of my old science fair notebook. The paper crinkled softly, a sound almost like applause, almost like a heartbeat. It was the sound of something beginning to grow, quietly, where no one thought it could. The sun was already slipping low by the time the graduation ceremony ended, painting the sky over Jefferson High in streaks of pink and gold. Everyone around me was glowing, caps tossed in the air, parents waving from the bleachers, the sound of laughter and applause echoing across the field. I remember thinking, for a split second, that maybe this was what it felt like to belong, to stand in the same light as everyone else. I held my diploma close, still warm from the stage lights, my name printed in sharp black letters that felt like a promise. Dad had said he'd meet me by the parking lot after the ceremony. I imagined we'd go to dinner, maybe the diner downtown where he liked the burgers, or home for one of Mom's casseroles. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight he'd look at me and finally see more than what I wasn't. When I found him, the crowd was already thinning. The stadium lights buzzed, and the janitors were starting to gather folding chairs. He stood by his old blue pickup truck, hands in his pockets, the same detached look on his face he wore whenever he had something unpleasant to say. Mom wasn't there. Lena was, though. Perfect curls, perfect makeup, her phone already out, ready to record something. "Hey," I said carefully, walking toward him, diploma still in my hand. "You came." He nodded once, no smile. "Yeah." His voice was flat. He turned, popped open the trunk, and pulled out a tan suitcase. It was old, scuffed at the corners, One of those hard-shell kinds with faded stickers from airlines that didn't even exist anymore. He set it down on the asphalt with a dull thud. "What's that?" I asked, half laughing, half nervous. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, really looked, and said, "Find your own family." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. The noise of the crowd swelled somewhere behind us, cheers and car horns blending into the sound of the summer evening. "What?" I said. "Find your own family," he repeated, slower this time. "You want to live your life your way? Then do it. You're grown now." Lena let out a small laugh. "Oh my God, Dad," she said, lifting her phone. "Say that again, that's perfect. I'm calling it adulting 101. He didn't react. He just shut the trunk, brushed his hands off, and turned away. The sound of the trunk slamming echoed through my chest like a closing door. "Wait," I started, but he was already walking toward the driver's side. "You can't just—" He paused just long enough to say, "We've done enough, Bonnie. It's time you figure it out." Then he got into the truck. The engine roared to life. Lena, still filming, stepped closer and angled the phone toward me. "Smile," she said, like this was a family moment worth remembering. I could see the reflection of my face in her phone's screen, eyes red, hair stuck to my forehead, the gold tassel of my cap tangled in my gown. I didn't smile. The truck pulled away slowly, the gravel crunching under the tires. For a second, I thought he'd stop, maybe just a few feet ahead, maybe turn back, laugh, say it was some kind of lesson in tough love. But the taillights grew smaller, dimmer, until they disappeared at the corner of the lot. I was alone. The noise from the field faded. The air smelled like burnt popcorn and exhaust. My name tag from the ceremony had peeled halfway off my gown, sweat making the paper curl at the edges. I looked down at the suitcase. The handle was cracked, one side fraying where the stitching had come loose. Someone had written initials on it, once faint, smudged, no longer legible. I touched it, half expecting it to hum with meaning, to hold something, anything that could make sense of what had just happened. But it was empty. When I lifted it, it felt lighter than air. That night, the school's floodlights began to shut off, one by one, until only the far end of the field still glowed. The laughter had faded into car doors slamming, engines starting, the hum of people heading home. I stood there long after everyone else was gone. The air turned colder. I didn't cry, not right away. Instead, I sat on the curb beside the suitcase, the asphalt still warm beneath me, and watched the street lamps flicker on. Somewhere nearby, a group of graduates shouted and whooped, their voices fading into the night. I wondered what it must feel like to go home to people waiting for you. A light breeze caught the tassel on my cap. I took it off and turned it over in my hands. The gold threads glinted faintly in the last light from the field. I thought about everything that had led to this, the years of invisible effort, the quiet wins no one clapped for, the letter from Purdue that no one cared about. I thought about the plastic chair at dinner, the uneven leg that never stopped squeaking. And then I thought about something else, the way machines always had a place, even broken ones. If a gear didn't fit, you didn't throw away the whole system, you built a new one. That was when it hit me. If they wouldn't give me a seat, I'd build my own table. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was clarity, sharp, cold, and clean. I stood, brushed the dust off my gown, and picked up the suitcase. The cracked handle dug into my palm, but I didn't let go. I walked toward the road, past the rows of parked cars, past the glowing gym windows where janitors were sweeping up confetti. The sound of my shoes on the pavement echoed in the stillness. At the intersection, I stopped and looked back. The field lights finally blinked off, plunging the school into darkness. Only the moonlight caught the faint edges of the bleachers and the metal railings. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. For the first time in my life, I realized I had nothing. No car, no plan, no home waiting. But I also realized something even stronger. I was free. The suitcase swung at my side as I walked toward the bus stop at the edge of town. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I wouldn't stay here. Not in a place where love had to be earned like wages. At the bench, I sat down and opened the suitcase again. Inside was a small envelope, $20, and a folded note. My father's handwriting. Don't call unless it's an emergency. I almost laughed. Even his generosity came with boundaries. The night grew colder. I curled my gown tighter around me, watching headlights streak past. One by one, the buses came and went routes I didn't recognize. When the last one finally stopped, I stood, climbed aboard, and dropped the only coins I had left into the slot. The driver glanced at me, his eyes kind but tired. "Where you headed?" "Anywhere," I said. He nodded and closed the doors. As the bus pulled away, I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching the outline of the school fade into the distance. The dark windows of the truck bays at the factory glimmered faintly in the distance, the same plant my father worked at, still awake long after families went to sleep. For a moment, I wondered if he was there, if he even thought about what he'd just done. But I didn't linger on it. I couldn't afford to. Because from that moment on, I wasn't his responsibility anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only gift he'd ever given me, the permission to start over. When the bus turned onto the highway, I looked down at the suitcase resting by my feet. It rattled slightly as the wheels hit a bump. Empty, hollow, yet somehow full of promise. I whispered to it, almost like a vow. "If they won't give me a seat," I said, "I'll build my own table." And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the fear, beneath the ache, something began to shift. Like an engine catching for the first time. Like motion finding its flow. The bus rolled into Columbus long after midnight, the windows fogged from rain and breath. By the time it hissed to a stop near the freight station, the city felt half alive, trucks rumbling through puddles, neon lights flickering over rows of warehouses, the faint smell of diesel and wet asphalt thick in the air. I stepped off with my suitcase, which thudded hollowly against the curb. It wasn't heavy, but somehow it still carried everything I was or had been. I didn't know where to go. The world felt enormous, uncaring, and fast. The freight yard stretched endlessly in both directions, its fences crowned with barbed wire, cranes shifting in the dark like slow metal giants. I found shelter under the loading awning of an old diner across the street, Earl's all-night eatery, its neon signs sputtering between Earl's and Eat. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon seeped through the glass. I pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling weakly. The place was nearly empty except for two truckers hunched over their plates and a woman behind the counter cleaning a coffee pot. She looked to be in her late 50s, hair tied in a red scarf, her name tag reading Miss Ruiz. "You lost, sweetheart?" she asked without looking up. I hesitated. "Not exactly, just between places." She raised an eyebrow, poured a cup of coffee, and slid it across the counter. "Between places costs $1.75. I fished the last of my change from my pocket and pushed it forward. She studied me for a second, then nodded toward the back. "You need work?" "Yes," I said quickly, maybe too quickly. "Night shift dishwasher, quit last week," she said. "You can start now if you're not afraid of grease." That's how my first real job began, not as an engineer, not as a dreamer, but as a dishwasher in a diner that smelled perpetually of burnt toast and second chances. The next few months blurred into one long stretch of nights and early mornings. I washed dishes until my fingers wrinkled and bled from the detergent. When the last trucker left, I scrubbed floors, refilled napkin dispensers, and mopped until the linoleum shone. Miss Ruiz was tough but fair, the kind of woman who could scold you and save your life in the same sentence. "Don't let anyone tell you hard work is noble," she'd say, lighting her cigarette by the back door. "It's just work. Do it well, but don't get stuck here thinking it means more than it does." She gave me a cot in the storage room behind the kitchen, right next to the sacks of flour and the old industrial mixer that hadn't worked in years. My bed smelled faintly of sugar and coffee grounds. The hum of the refrigerator became my lullaby. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard the familiar rumble of diesel outside. A truck had pulled up behind the diner, and a man climbed out tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked in silver. He wore a delivery jacket and carried himself with the ease of someone who'd seen the whole country one highway at a time. "Gabe," Miss Ruiz called from the counter. "You're late again." He chuckled, voice gravelly. "Traffic on I-70. You try getting past a jackknifed rig and a cop who wants to measure your blinkers." He noticed me standing there, wiping down the counter. "New kid?" he asked. "Yeah," Miss Ruiz said. "Keeps her head down, works hard, doesn't talk much. Don't scare her off with your road stories." He smiled, a soft crinkle forming at the corners of his eyes. Fair enough. Over time, Gabe became my second teacher, though he never called himself that. He'd stop by a few nights a week, nursing his black coffee while waiting for a pickup order. He always sat at the same booth near the window, where the streetlight spilled gold across the table. "You ever think about how everything moves?" he asked one night, drawing routes on a napkin with his pen. "Every crate, every shipment, every truck. It's all one big circulatory system. The world's heartbeat runs on diesel." I listened quietly, fascinated. "How do you keep track of it all?" He grinned. "You don't, you flow with it. You figure out where the bottlenecks are and fix them before they choke the line. You balance weight, time, and distance. Get those wrong, and you lose hours. Get them right." He tapped the napkin, where his lines intersected perfectly. "And the whole world hums." The idea lodged itself deep in my mind. Flow, balance. Systems that made sense when people didn't. Eventually, he started showing me the basics of what he did: how to load a truck so it wouldn't tip, how to stack pallets to distribute weight evenly, how to read a bill of lading and plan routes that saved fuel. "Every minute matters," he said. "Every stop costs money. You save 10 minutes a trip, you're not just saving gas, you're saving someone's week." He let me ride along on local deliveries sometimes. Miss Ruiz pretended not to notice. I'd sit in the passenger seat, notebook in hand, scribbling down everything: street names, stop times, traffic patterns, how long each dock took to unload. I started recognizing patterns: which warehouses were always backed up, which routes were clear after midnight, how weather could shift the entire schedule. The system wasn't chaos, not really. It just looked that way to people who didn't care to understand it. I began to map things out on graph paper during my breaks: arrows, columns, grids. Gabe would lean over my shoulder and whistle. "You got the eyes for it, kid. You see the flow." Sometimes, when I asked about his past, he'd just shrug. 30 years on the road, I've seen the same mistakes 1,000 times: companies running blind, people too proud to fix what's broken. You're young enough to change that." I didn't know what to say, but I wrote that line down, too. Young enough to change that. Money was tight, but Miss Ruiz made sure I never starved. "You work, you eat," she'd say, sliding a plate of fries across the counter at the end of a shift. She started paying me cash under the table. It wasn't much, but it was enough for bus fare and notebooks. One evening, after another long shift, I found myself standing outside the diner, staring at the rows of trucks idling near the freight yard. The sound of their engines created a low, constant vibration, a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. The air was thick with exhaust and possibility. I realized I'd started memorizing not just routes, but patterns: which drivers showed up first, which docks moved fastest, how cargo rotated between warehouses like veins in a body. I wasn't part of the system, not yet, but I was learning its pulse. Gabe noticed my growing obsession. "You ever think about going back to school?" he asked one night as we unloaded crates. "I don't have the money," I said. He nodded, thoughtful. "Then make the road your school. Everything you need to learn is moving right in front of you. Just keep your eyes open." That night, as I lay on my cot in the storage room, I flipped through my notebook. The pages were filled with arrows, times, hand-drawn grids, numbers messy, scattered, alive. It looked like chaos, but to me, it felt like order waiting to be revealed. I realized something I hadn't felt in months: curiosity. The kind that makes you forget you're tired or scared. When dawn crept through the diner windows, turning the flour sacks pale gold, I packed my things, put on my apron, and started another shift. I wasn't sure where life was heading, but I could feel motion building, the slow kind that starts in the background before it becomes unstoppable. Some nights, when the diner was empty and the hum of the fridges filled the silence, I'd look at the road outside and whisper to myself, "Flow." It wasn't just a word anymore. It was a promise that even if I was stranded, even if no one was waiting for me at the end of a shift, I was still part of something moving. And someday, I'd figure out how to design the system that never left anyone behind. The summer heat in Columbus hit like a furnace. Even at night, the air around the diner shimmered, thick with exhaust and humidity. The freight yard across the street buzzed, with movement forklifts screeching, truck doors slamming, horns echoing in the dark. I'd gotten used to it, the rhythm of motion that never slept. By then, I'd been working at Earl's for almost a year. Miss Ruiz still barked orders like a drill sergeant, but now she trusted me with closing shifts. Gabe still rolled in 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, his rig idling out back while he ate his eggs and coffee. And me? I still lived in the small cot behind the kitchen, but my notebooks had grown thicker, pages filled with charts, arrows, and timing logs. It happened on one of those nights when the diner was quiet, too quiet. The radio hummed softly from the counter. Gabe sat in his usual booth, scribbling delivery notes, while I refilled salt shakers. He was muttering to himself about being behind schedule. 3 plants tomorrow, he said, shaking his head. 1 in Grove City, 1 in Dayton, 1 near Springfield. Each one wants their drop before noon. You'd think they coordinate. I glanced at the clipboard on his table. The route times were neatly written, one after another: Grove City first, then Dayton, then Springfield. I looked closer and noticed something that didn't fit. The map in my mind lit up. "Why that order?" I asked. He looked up, frowning. "Because that's how they send it. Same every week. But if you go Dayton first, then Grove, then Springfield, you'd cut backtracking in half," I said. I pointed at his route list. "Right now you're crossing I-70 twice." He blinked, then smirked. "You sure about that, kid?" "Pretty sure," I said. "If you leave half an hour earlier and hit Dayton first, you'll be at Grove right as their dock opens. Springfield's late shift closes at 2, so you'd still make it. No waiting." He leaned back, thoughtful. "You saying you can outsmart dispatch?" "I'm saying their system doesn't look at time as flow, it looks at it as blocks." "Flow, huh?" he repeated, amused. "All right, you win. Let's try it your way." The next morning, Gabe called me from the road. "You're a damn wizard," he said. "No backup, no dock delay. Saved me almost an hour and a half. Didn't even burn half the usual fuel." I laughed, gripping the phone with greasy hands. Guess I just saw a pattern. But that word flow stuck with me. That night, after my shift, I sat by the window of the diner with my notebook open. I wrote the word in the center of the page. Flow. Around it, I drew arrows connecting all the small inefficiencies I'd seen over the past months: late docks, blocked routes, mismatched shifts. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. The system wasn't broken because people were lazy. It was broken because no one looked at the whole picture. A week later, I found a used laptop at a pawn shop for $45. It was old, slow, and missing half its keys, but it ran Excel and that was all I needed. I spent my nights inputting route data: times, stops, distances, fuel logs. I mapped them against traffic patterns I'd memorized from my rides with Gabe. It was messy at first, just columns of numbers that didn't seem to mean much. But slowly, the spreadsheet began to tell a story. One evening, while scrolling through an online logistics forum at the laundromat, the only place with free Wi-Fi, I stumbled across two words that made everything click: throughput and bottleneck. It was like hearing the name of something I'd been trying to describe my whole life. Throughput, how much a system can handle efficiently. Bottleneck, the one point that slows everything down. That was it. The diner, the docks, the routes, every problem I'd seen came down to one of those two things. The system didn't need more work, it needed flow. I spent the next few weeks building what I started calling my route board. I used an old corkboard from Miss Ruiz's storage room and pinned printed maps of the region on it. I drew colored threads between locations to represent routes, small pushpins marking warehouses, delivery zones, and fuel stops. At the bottom corner, I taped a hand-drawn grid showing travel times and dock delays. Miss Ruiz caught me one night while I was hunched over it in the back room. "You're turning my diner into NASA," she said, hands on her hips. I grinned. "Just testing something." She squinted at the maps. "And that something pays?" "Not yet," I said, "but it will." Gabe was the first to test the full board. I recalculated his weekly schedule using my new system, balancing drive time against dock openings and rest breaks. He laughed when I handed him the printout. "You really think this works better than dispatch?" Only one way to find out. 2 days later, he walked back into the diner with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "You're a genius," he said. 3 routes, 4 hours shorter total, saved me $60 in fuel. He tossed a crumpled 20 on the counter. "Your first consulting fee." I didn't take it, but I couldn't stop smiling. That single success turned into an avalanche of small experiments. I began tracking every shipment that passed through the freight yard, not officially, of course, just quietly. I'd mark down which trucks left when, how long they waited to load, which routes hit delays. Patterns emerged like constellations. One dock was always late because the night shift had fewer workers. One route always slowed down because of school traffic near a particular exit. I learned to predict it and, more importantly, how to fix it. At first, I didn't think much of the small wins. But when Gabe told other drivers about me, they started asking for help too. One guy wanted to optimize his delivery sequence. Another needed to find a route that avoided construction zones. I helped them all, not for money, just for practice. The diner became my unofficial office, the counter my command center. Even Miss Ruiz started to notice. "You're getting too smart for this place," she said one night, wiping down the grill. "You keep fixing other people's messes. One day someone's gonna pay you real money to do it." She wasn't wrong. Within 2 months, I'd saved enough from my diner shifts and Gabe's referrals to afford a tiny room above a laundromat 2 blocks away. It wasn't much, just a twin bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the back of the freight yard, but it was mine. For the first time since graduation, I had an address that wasn't the storage room behind a diner. The first night there, I stayed up late, staring at the blinking red lights of the trucks moving in the distance. They looked like veins, pulsing with life. The hum of engines below became a lullaby again, but this time, not of exhaustion, but possibility. I opened my laptop and wrote a single line at the top of a new sheet. System equals flow, bottleneck. That became my creed. Every night after that, I refined the board, learning, testing, adjusting. When things went wrong, I fixed them. When they went right, I found ways to make them better. Sometimes, I'd still visit Miss Ruiz after my shift, just to check in. She'd shake her head and laugh. "You're chasing ghosts, kid," she'd say. But I knew better. I wasn't chasing ghosts. I was following the current, and for the first time, I was starting to understand how to steer it. Opportunity rarely knocks sometimes, it just sends an exhausted man through a diner door. One sticky August afternoon, a guy in a rumpled button-down came into Earl's, slumped at the counter like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 shipments on his back. "Miss Ruiz poured him coffee without asking. "Rough day, Tom?" she said. "Rough week," he muttered. "Half my dispatch team quit. If one more driver calls in late, I'll start running the routes myself." That was the first time I heard the name Riverline Logistics, a small, family-owned transport company with a cluster of warehouses by the interstate, about 20 minutes from downtown Columbus. I'd heard Gabe mention them before. Old school outfit, he'd said once. Good people, bad systems. Miss Ruiz glanced at me over the coffee pot. You still looking for better work, kid? I froze mid-wipe, rag in hand. Depends what better means. Tom snorted. Can you type? Fast enough, I said. He rubbed his temples. We need someone to help with order entry and trip scheduling. Mostly data entry, dock coordination, calling drivers when they forget paperwork. It's chaos, but it pays more than scrubbing plates. I didn't hesitate. When do I start? Tom looked me up and down. A 20-year-old girl in a diner apron, hair tied back, grease under her nails. Tomorrow, he said finally. Don't make me regret it. Riverline was tucked behind a chain-link fence and a half-paved parking lot littered with gravel and oil stains. The building was squat and beige, the kind of place that looked permanent only because it had nowhere else to go. Inside, it smelled like dust, burnt coffee, and printer toner. The air buzzed with radios and the steady clatter of keyboards. My first desk was an old metal table pushed against the wall of the dispatch office. I had a phone, a stack of bills of lading, and a single instruction from Tom: don't lose anything. The first week nearly broke me. Phones rang nonstop, drivers needing directions, customers demanding updates, warehouses complaining about late pickups. Every sentence seemed to end with, as soon as possible. The board behind Tom's desk looked like a crime scene, magnets for every truck, color-coded routes strung together with dry erase chaos. But the noise didn't scare me. It fascinated me. Because underneath the shouting and confusion, I could sense a pattern, a pulse. Every driver, every route, every shipment moved in relation to another. They just couldn't see it. Tom was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from fatigue and good humor. He'd been in logistics since before GPS was mainstream, and he carried that rare mix of skepticism and curiosity. You're quiet, he told me one afternoon, leaning on my desk. Listening, I said. To what? The rhythm, I replied. You've got a bottleneck between Dock 3 and Dock 5 every day between 2 and 3 p.m. He raised an eyebrow. And how would you know that? I've been tracking the radio logs, I admitted, flipping open my notebook. Every time a driver checks in late, it's because Dock 3 is still unloading. If you swapped one Groveport run with the Newark pickup, you'd balance the load times. He studied me for a moment, then let out a low whistle. You're seeing things most folks never notice. You keep that up, and you'll make me look bad. That was the beginning of my apprenticeship. Tom started teaching me the language of logistics, the real one, the kind you don't learn in manuals. He showed me how to read a bold bill of lading, the legal heartbeat of every shipment. If you understand this, he said, tapping the paper, you understand everything. Weight, freight class, liability, routing. This is the DNA of the load. He walked me through OEE, overall equipment. Effectiveness, how delays multiplied through a system like dominoes. Every minute a forklift's idle is another truck late to the dock, he said. You can't fix a system until you know where time disappears. He even took me to the docks, teaching me how to read the choreography of loading, the clatter of pallets, the hiss of air brakes, the rhythm of engines idling. See that? He said, pointing to a forklift trapped between two trailers. That's a $200 mistake every time it happens. Not because of gas, but because of momentum. I absorbed it all like oxygen. At night, when everyone else went home, I'd stay behind, rearranging schedules on Tom's whiteboard, running numbers through my laptop. The office was quiet, then just the hum of the vending machine and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. I'd print out the dock logs, spread them across the floor, and look for flow. One evening, Tom found me there surrounded by papers. You planning to sleep here? He joked. I smiled without looking up. Just testing something. He peered over my shoulder at the spreadsheet glowing on the screen. What am I looking at? Dock throughput, I said. You've been assigning forklifts by head count instead of load frequency. If we shift 2 operators from dock 2 to dock 5 between noon and 2, we'll cut congestion by 30%. He crossed his arms. You actually ran the math? I nodded. All right, genius, he said. We'll try it tomorrow. The next day, we did. The result was immediate. Forklift jams disappeared. Trucks rolled out on time. The radio chatter, normally filled with frustration, was quiet. By the end of the shift, Tom leaned against the doorway, grinning. You just saved us 45 minutes per cycle, he said. That's almost 1 extra route per day. I laughed, exhausted but giddy. So the math works in real life. He nodded. Always does if you've got the guts to test it. From then on, Tom stopped calling me kid and started calling me dispatcher. He pushed me to learn everything. How to negotiate with warehouse managers for dock times, how to balance loads by axle weight, how to calculate fuel ratios in my head. He'd bark across the office, "Park. What's the cubic weight on a 42-inch pallet of pipe fittings?" And I'd shout back, 468, depending on gauge. Sometimes he'd laugh so hard the whole team would turn to look. But the best lessons came from the silences. Late at night, after everyone else left, he'd sit in his office nursing black coffee and tell stories about how he'd started. Back then, he said, we used paper maps and gut instinct. Now it's software and sensors. But the rules don't change. The fastest path isn't always the best one. You design flow around people, not just trucks. I wrote that down word for word. Months passed, and the rhythm of Riverline became my heartbeat. The radio static no longer sounded like chaos, it was a melody. Every number on the screen meant something. Every delay had a cause I could trace and fix. I was no longer just reacting to problems, I was anticipating them. When I realized that one supplier's late paperwork was slowing down 4 separate routes, I drafted a new documentation process, color-coded forms, pre-checked templates. Tom implemented it company-wide. You might have just saved me from an ulcer, he said. It was the first time I saw my name Bonnie Park on the dispatch board as the author of a new system. I didn't cry, but I did stare at it for a long time. By winter, Riverline's performance reports were up 12%, and Tom joked that I should be running the place. Not yet, I said, but someday. And I meant it. The night I realized how far I'd come, the plant was nearly empty. Snow drifted against the loading bay doors, and the halogen lights threw long shadows across the floor. I stood on the catwalk above the docks, clipboard in hand, watching forklifts glide like synchronized dancers. No jams, no shouting, no wasted motion. For the first time since that night in the parking lot, I felt steady, like I'd found a system that made sense. Down below, Tom called up. What are you still doing here? I smiled. Just watching the flow. He laughed. You sound like a dispatcher already. I'm not, I said softly, looking at the clean lines of movement below. Not yet, but I'm getting there. And that night, with the snow falling quietly outside and the hum of the plant in my chest, I knew I'd found my purpose, not in belonging to someone, but in building something that moved. It started small, like most revolutions do, with a spreadsheet, a stubborn idea, and a used laptop whose fan wheezed like an old dog. By the time I left Riverline, I had learned more about logistics than any textbook could teach: how docks jammed, how routes broke, how every minute lost in a shift could ripple across an entire supply chain. But what I hadn't learned was how to stop seeing those flaws even when I closed my eyes. Every system I touched, every process I watched, I saw the same sickness: wasted time, bottlenecks, miscommunication. People breaking themselves to fix what the numbers could have told them all along. I was 23 when the idea for plant flow arrived. It wasn't a thunderclap or some grand moment of genius. It was 2:17 a.m., and I was sitting at my kitchen table, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. I was reviewing 3 separate dock schedules from suppliers in the area, each of them color-coded differently, tracked by hand, and emailed back and forth 10 times a day. I stared at the chaos of overlapping slots and thought, what if they all just talk to each other? The thought hit like caffeine. That night, I built the first version, nothing more than a Google Sheet with formulas and a few conditional color codes. Green meant open, yellow meant pending, red meant blocked. I connected each tab with a timestamp, so when one dock filled, another shifted automatically. It was clunky, primitive, but the moment I hit run, and the boxes reorganized themselves into a clean, flowing sequence, I laughed out loud. For the first time, I'd watched flow happen on its own. I showed it to Tom a few days later when I stopped by Riverline to visit. He peered at the screen, squinting. So, it's a dock scheduler? Not just a scheduler, I said. It predicts bottlenecks based on inbound traffic and shift overlap. It balances throughput automatically. End quote. He gave a low whistle. That's one way to put me out of a job. Or make it easier, I countered. He grinned. You always did think 3 steps ahead. That was the day I decided to build it into something real. I called the project Plant Flow, a name that captured both the factory and the current that ran through it. I had no funding, no partner, no code experience beyond Excel macros and free Python tutorials. But I had one advantage no investor could buy. I knew the pain I was solving. I spent nights watching YouTube videos on how to use the Google Maps API, teaching myself the basics of JavaScript and routing algorithms. The term TSP, traveling salesman problem, became my new obsession. I scribbled formulas on napkins, tested them with Gabe's old delivery data, and slowly, painfully, created something that almost worked. After 3 months, I had a crude MVP, a minimum viable product. It wasn't pretty, but it could take a list of delivery stops, calculate distances, and output an optimized route using simple heuristics. When the code finally ran without crashing, I sat back in my chair, exhausted and trembling. It wasn't software yet, but it was alive. My first real client came from a chance encounter at a diner, the same one where everything in my life had once begun. A man named Carl, who managed a small metal casting shop, came in complaining about shipping delays. I told him I might be able to help. You build software? He asked, skeptical. I build systems, I said. Software is just the tool. He let me try. I input his weekly delivery schedule, 8 stops across 3 counties, into PlantFlow and handed him the optimized routes. He followed them for 2 weeks. Then one morning, I opened my inbox to find an email from him. The subject line read, "You saved our quarter." Inside, it said, "Your program cut our delivery delays by 40%. We were bleeding fuel and missing contracts. You just helped us survive." I stared at that message for a long time. Not because of pride, but because for the first time in my life, something I built mattered. That email became my North Star. Word spread quietly. A small auto parts distributor asked if I could help them streamline their drop-offs. Then a regional bakery chain. Then a local manufacturer who'd heard some girl in Columbus had built a magic spreadsheet. Each time, I refined PlantFlow, improving the interface, cleaning the data, adding error checks. I charged almost nothing, just enough to cover hosting costs. But every new client gave me more data, more feedback, more proof that I was solving a real problem. One night, while checking my inbox, I saw an ad for a scholarship program. Online certification in supply chain innovation, National Logistics Institute. It was designed for professionals already in the field. I applied on a whim, never expecting to hear back. A month later, I opened an email that started with, "Congratulations, Miss Park." It felt like the world cracked open. The classes were virtual, but they changed everything. For the first time, I had words for the instincts I'd built on the job. Lean flow, constraint theory, predictive scheduling. Every lecture felt like uncovering a language I'd already been speaking without knowing it. I spent nights refining my algorithms, improving PlantFlow's heuristic model to account for dynamic traffic and shift variances. In one assignment, I built a simulation that modeled truck arrivals at different intervals. The professor emailed me afterward, saying, "You've got the bones of a commercial platform here." That line lit a fuse. I started searching for freelance developers, people who could turn my rough code into a real product. I found two: Raj, a backend engineer from Mumbai, and Tessa, a UI designer from Minneapolis. We met over video calls, often at midnight my time. I couldn't pay much, but I offered them a promise. "We're building something that makes small factories run like giants." They believed me. For months, our lives revolved around that code. Raj handled the APIs, Tessa shaped the dashboard, and I handled everything else: the logistics logic, the math, the late-night testing. I bought used monitors from a thrift shop and turned my living room into a miniature control center. There were nights the system crashed at 3 a.m., and I'd sit there in tears, retyping formulas until dawn. But when the screen finally lit up with smooth data visualizations, I felt something deeper than victory clarity. That's when I renamed the company Atlas Flow Technologies. It wasn't just a brand. It was a statement that what once crushed me could now be something I carried with strength. Atlas didn't fight the world, he held it up. We incorporated in Columbus, Ohio, the same city where I'd once scrubbed plates and tracked deliveries on napkins. My first act as CEO was symbolic. I scanned two things and framed them side by side: the signed contract from Carl's Foundry, my first paying client, and the old clock, in card from Riverline, still smudged with oil. Beneath it, I wrote, "Never forget the factory floor." Atlas Flow's growth wasn't dramatic. It was slow, steady, like watching gears turn into engines. The app began syncing real-time GPS with dock availability. We partnered with a regional distributor to test predictive rescheduling. I visited warehouses, spoke with drivers, collected feedback. Every update came from something real: a tired dispatcher's complaint, a frustrated driver's story, a factory foreman's wish that someone just make this easier. By our first year, we'd onboarded 10 clients. By our second, 30. Every milestone felt surreal, especially when I realized that one of our new users was a parts supplier that had once refused my job application. One evening, sitting in my new office, a repurposed co-working space overlooking downtown Columbus, I stared at the live dashboard. Hundreds of trucks pulsed across the screen, each dot representing a driver whose route I'd helped design. The hum of the city outside echoed the rhythm I'd once memorized from the freight yard. It wasn't just about logistics anymore. It was about people, the invisible ones who made the world move. When I finally hired my first full-time employee, I asked what made her join. She said, "You actually care about the people behind the data." That stuck with me. Because maybe that was the real reason Atlas Flow worked, not because it optimized numbers, but because it respected the human flow behind them. Still, I couldn't escape the memory of that night: the suitcase, the parking lot, the words, "Find your own family." Now, when I looked around at my small but growing team, Raj in his late-night Slack messages, Tessa sending design updates, the interns laughing in the hallway, I realized they were my family. Built, not born. The company's first major breakthrough came when a national parts distributor emailed us. "We saw your work with Riverline. Our dock scheduling system is in chaos. Can you help?" It was poetic, a full circle I didn't expect. Tom still worked there, now as operations manager. When he heard I was behind Atlas Flow, he called me. "You're still fixing my messes, huh?" I laughed. Still learning from them. We integrated Atlas Flow into their entire regional operation: predictive dock allocation, live traffic rerouting, shift analytics. Within 3 months, their throughput jumped 22%. Tom sent me a message afterward. "You've built something big, Bonnie. Bigger than you realize." I didn't reply right away. I just stared at that line, then at the framed card on my wall: "Never forget the factory floor." Because I hadn't. and I never would. The day Atlas Flow crossed 100 active clients, I walked outside and stood on the rooftop terrace of our office. The air smelled of steel and summer rain. I could hear the distant hum of trucks on the interstate, the same song that had once been my lullaby. I thought about that young girl in the diner with grease under her nails, sketching flowcharts on napkins. About the woman now standing here, with a company she'd built from nothing but failure and persistence. It was all one continuous route. And though I didn't know it yet, that same route was about to lead me back to the very place where it all began. To the factory that had once called me unrealistic. And to the man who had once told me to find my own family. The email came on a gray Monday morning in October, the kind of day that smelled like rust and rain. Subject line: Potential acquisition, Midwest Forge and Parts. At first, I didn't even open it. Atlas Flow had started getting weekly offers and partnership proposals ever since our software expanded into predictive logistics. But when my operations lead mentioned the company's location, Dayton, Ohio, I froze. I knew that name. I knew it too well. Midwest Forge and Parts. The factory where my father had worked his entire life. The same plant whose siren used to echo across our neighborhood every evening, signaling the end of his shift. I could still remember standing by the gate as a child, rain dripping down my hood, waiting for him to emerge from behind the turnstile, his face always half tired, half distant, like he belonged to the machines more than he ever belonged to me. Now, the plant was collapsing. The report detailed everything. Outdated production systems, 6-month lead time delays, storage overflows, and millions lost in idle inventory. Their logistics were running on handwritten schedules, dock queues overlapping by hours. The owner, a man named Harold Dunn, was looking to sell his controlling shares before the company went bankrupt. I stared at the report for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the laptop screen. It would have been easy to close it, to tell myself that this was coincidence. But I couldn't. The moment I saw the aerial photo of that factory, the same row of chimneys, the same cracked parking lot, the same rusted gate, something inside me shifted. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was gravity. The kind that pulls you back to the place where everything began. That night, I called an emergency meeting with my board. "We're buying Midwest Forge," I said. There was silence on the other end. Finally, Raj spoke. "That's an old plant, Bonnie. Outdated equipment, union issues, messy books. Why them?" "Because their logistics failure is exactly what Atlas Flow was built to fix," I said steadily. "They don't need to die, they just need a system." And maybe, I thought quietly, so do I. Negotiations took months. Harold was tired, desperate to sell but still clinging to pride. When we finally agreed on a deal, 70% acquisition, with Atlas Flow as the new operational backbone, I felt an odd calm. We weren't just buying a company. We were inheriting a legacy of inefficiency that mirrored everything my childhood had taught me about imbalance and neglect. The morning the papers were signed, I stood in our Columbus office conference room, holding the final page with trembling hands. The black ink of my signature looked sharp against the pale blue company seal. Atlas Flow Technologies now owned 70% of Midwest Forge and Parts. The very factory that had once told me I didn't belong. We didn't announce it publicly right away. The integration began quietly, phase by phase. Our engineers mapped the production lines into a digital twin, a virtual replica of the factory that simulated every process from raw material intake to outbound shipments. Within weeks, we identified bottlenecks that had gone unnoticed for years: overlapping shifts, misaligned tool setups, even forklifts idling because of broken scanners. We introduced a dock scheduler, the same kind I'd once built on a Google Sheet years earlier. Trucks that had been waiting for hours were now cycling in and out in half the time. For the first time in a decade, Midwest's output began climbing again. Workers noticed it before management did. But through all of it, I stayed anonymous. My name never appeared on the internal memos. The employees only knew that some tech firm in Columbus had taken over operations. When I visited the plant, I wore a simple gray coat and kept my badge clipped low. Operations Consultant, Atlas Flow. I walked the floor quietly, listening to the hum of the machines, the clang of steel, the shouts of foremen directing crews. And then, one afternoon, I heard it, the voice I'd know anywhere. "Let's move those pallets to line C. And watch the torque on that press, it's been acting up again." My father, Robert Park, foreman of Assembly Section 2. He hadn't changed much, maybe a little grayer, a little slower, but the same posture, the same clipped tone of authority. He passed within a few feet of me, glancing my way with a flicker of polite recognition before moving on. He didn't recognize me. How could he? The last time he saw me, I was a trembling 18-year-old holding a diploma and a suitcase. Now I was a woman in a tailored coat, hair pinned neatly, tablet in hand. I'd become everything he said I couldn't be. Still, standing there in that factory, his world, my wound, I felt the weight of history pressing down. The clang of metal sounded like ghosts speaking. That night, I walked through the empty plant after everyone left. The air smelled of oil and heat. I stopped near Dock 5, where a new Atlas Flow monitor displayed a clean digital schedule glowing blue against the wall. At the top corner, bold letters read, "Under new ownership, Atlas Flow Technologies." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. This was the same space where my father once taught me how to tell time by the whistle of the lunch bell. Now the clocks ran on my algorithms. 2 weeks later, we made the official announcement. All employees were gathered in the main assembly hall for a partnership briefing. Rows of steel chairs filled the floor, the smell of machine grease mingling with coffee and anticipation. My team set up the projector, the new logo gleaming on the big screen, a looping infinity symbol shaped like intersecting roads, Atlas Flow. As I waited backstage, I could hear murmurs ripple through the crowd. New investors? Some software people. I heard they're cutting management. Tom, who'd flown in from Columbus to support me, placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You ready?" I exhaled slowly. As ready as I'll ever be. When I stepped onto the stage, the noise faded into silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, engineers, welders, managers, the men and women who kept the machines alive. In the second row, I saw him, my father, standing beside the supervisors, hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to place my face. "Good morning," I began, voice clear but calm. "My name is Bonnie Park, CEO of Atlas Flow Technologies." A murmur swept through the crowd. My father's head snapped up, eyes widening. For a moment, I thought he might collapse. "I know this plant," I continued, scanning the faces. "I know its rhythm, its heartbeat, its people. I know the sound of the presses, the smell of the forge, the patience it takes to turn raw steel into something that moves the world. Because once, I waited outside those gates, too, wondering what kind of life was being built inside." The silence deepened. "Our goal isn't to erase the past," I said softly, "but to bring it forward, to make Midwest Forge a model for modern manufacturing. We'll integrate digital twins, dock automation, and predictive maintenance. No one's losing their job. You're not being replaced. You're being upgraded." Applause rippled through the room, hesitant at first, then stronger. Only one person didn't clap. My father. He just stood there, frozen, face pale, jaw tight. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. I held his gaze for one long moment, steady but not cruel. It wasn't vengeance I wanted him to feel. It was recognition. Behind him, a familiar face lifted a phone, my sister, Lena. She was live streaming the event, whispering something to her coworker. I could see the confusion dawning on her face as she zoomed in on the nameplate hanging from my blazer, Bonnie Park, CEO. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch under their eyes. After the meeting, as people crowded around asking questions and shaking hands, I caught a glimpse of my father slipping quietly toward the exit. I didn't follow him. There would be time later. For now, I stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by machines that were finally running on time, under a banner that read, "Under new ownership." The same words that once meant exile now meant something else entirely. Control. Return. Justice written in structure, not anger. And as the workers dispersed, the lights dimming above the polished steel floor, I allowed myself one quiet thought, one full-circle whisper that only I could hear. I found my own family. This. The morning after the announcement, the plant was eerily quiet. Word had spread fast not just that Atlas Flow now owned Midwest Forge, but that the woman who had stood on stage yesterday, calm and composed, was the daughter of one of the foremen. By the time I arrived, whispers had already carved their way through every corridor, bouncing between steel beams and worn-out break rooms like ghostly echoes of disbelief. My assistant met me outside the conference wing. "The department leads are waiting in the small meeting room," she said, lowering her voice. "Mr. Park is with them." My pulse steadied. "Good," I said. "It's time." Inside, the room was the same kind I'd sat in hundreds of times before: plain table, metal chairs, coffee machine humming in the corner. But today, the air felt thicker. The managers straightened when I entered. My father sat at the far end, the chair beside him empty. His hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white. The same hands that once lifted me onto his shoulders when I was 5 now trembled slightly under the fluorescent light. I carried a small, battered suitcase, the same one he'd handed me 15 years ago. The leather had cracked along the edges, the old airline sticker half peeled away. I set it down gently on the table. The sound echoed in the silence. No one spoke. "I brought something," I said quietly. "A piece of company history, personal but relevant." "Artly." A few of the supervisors exchanged confused glances. My father stared at the suitcase, recognition flashing in his eyes like lightning behind clouds. "That night," I began, my voice even, "you told me to find my own family." I rested my palm on the suitcase. "And I did." His lips tightened. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said. "You didn't want a daughter who built things you couldn't see value in. You wanted obedience, not independence. You told yourself it was tough love." He straightened in his chair, defensive. "I was teaching you to survive. To be self-reliant." I looked him in the eye. That wasn't self-reliance. That was abandonment. The words fell heavy, quiet but absolute. No one dared to breathe. Even the hum of the old air conditioner seemed to fade. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. For a brief second, the mask-cracked guilt flickered, just enough to be seen, before pride rebuilt itself over his face. I exhaled softly, turning to the rest of the room. "The past isn't why we're here. Atlas Flow didn't acquire this plant to relive history. We're here to rebuild structure, accountability, communication, and systems that work. This factory will not run on personal grudges. It will run on flow." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, rectangular tag glossy, printed with the company's logo. I peeled off the backing and pressed it gently against the suitcase handle. The new white label read, "Atlas Flow Asset Number 001. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. "This suitcase," I said, "used to represent being cast out. Now, it's company property. Cataloged, accounted for, a part of the system." I looked directly at my father again. Even pain, when processed correctly, becomes structure. He said nothing. But his eyes followed my hand as I pushed the suitcase aside, reclaiming it not as a memory, but as proof of how far I'd come. "Meeting adjourned," I said softly. "Please prepare your department reports for the operations rollout this afternoon." Everyone stood, murmuring acknowledgments as they filed out. My father stayed seated, staring at the table. As I turned to leave, he spoke, his voice rougher than I remembered. "You really think systems can fix everything?" I paused by the door. "No," I said. "But they can keep people from breaking everything again." Then I left him sitting there, in the room where silence finally weighed more than excuses. That afternoon, the factory floor was alive again, not with chaos, but anticipation. Every worker had gathered around the main assembly line where a large monitor displayed the new Atlas Flow operations dashboard. The screen pulsed with digital maps, color-coded routes, and real-time dock schedules. For many of them, this was the first time they'd seen data move faster than machinery. I stepped onto the small platform by the main line. My voice carried easily over the hum of the machines. From today, I began, Midwest Forge runs on transparency. Every department, machining, assembly, shipping, maintenance, will report through our new integrated system. A few murmurs rose from the crowd. Some nodded, others looked wary. This isn't just software, I continued. It's accountability. The system will track downtime, dock delays, maintenance intervals, and safety compliance. There won't be blame, only information. If a process slows, we'll see why and fix it. I caught sight of my father near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Each team will submit reports directly to the operations division at the end of every shift, I said. Operations will compile daily performance metrics, which will be reviewed every Friday. I paused. And operations reports directly to me. The words hung in the air, not loud, but solid, like steel locking into place. My gaze moved to where my father stood, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met. He didn't flinch. He just nodded slightly, not in defiance, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Justice, I thought, doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with structure. Over the next few days, the transformation was visible. The noise of miscommunication began to fade. The plant's rhythm changed smoother, faster, almost musical. People began to trust the system because it worked. The dock jams disappeared, late shipments dropped. Energy bills fell by 10% in a week. One evening, as I walked through the plant, I saw my father leaning over a workstation, helping a younger employee adjust a torque setting. When he noticed me, he straightened awkwardly. "How's the throughput?" I asked. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Better. The dashboard's catching delays before we even notice them." I nodded. "Good, that's the goal." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Your system's impressive." I smiled faintly. "It's not mine anymore. It's the company's, everyone's." He looked down at the floor, then back at me. "You really did find your own family, didn't you?" I met his gaze. "Yes," I said softly. "And I built it." He gave a slow nod, the first real one in 15 years. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the operations office. The suitcase sat on the corner desk, now tagged and logged in our system like any other asset. The old leather gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, the Atlas Flow logo reflecting on its brass clasp. I ran my fingers over the tag, feeling its smooth surface, a symbol of how something once meant for exile had become part of a structure that held hundreds of lives together. When I'd been 18, that suitcase was the weight of rejection. Now, it was proof of reclamation. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer. Justice isn't revenge, it's structure. I'm in. Outside the window, the factory glowed under the floodlights, every dock synchronized, every truck aligned. The hum of the conveyors below was steady, confident, a rhythm finally in harmony. And for the first time since that night at the bus stop, I didn't feel like the world was moving without me. I was the one who had built the flow. It was close to midnight when I walked across the empty parking lot, the factory lights burning pale against the fog. The hum of the machines had quieted hours ago, leaving only the faint echo of the night shift's last forklift somewhere in the distance. My heels clicked softly on the concrete as I headed toward the old turnstile gate, the one I used to stand beside as a child, clutching my raincoat, waiting for my father to come out at the end of his shift. The same gate that had once marked the boundary between his world and mine. Now, I was on both sides of it. The air smelled of steel and rain. I carried the old suitcase in one hand, empty now, lighter than it had ever felt before. The leather was worn, the handle polished smooth from years of carrying the memory of that night. I stopped at the gate, tracing the cold metal bars with my fingertips, then knelt and placed the suitcase on the ground beside the new company policy board. Inside it, I had left only two things: my old clock, in card from Riverline Oil, stained and faded, and a printed copy of the Midwest Forge acquisition contract, signed with my name. The beginning and the full circle, sitting quietly together inside one shell. The night wind brushed against my face, carrying the faint clang of distant machinery. I looked up at the gate, the same turnstile that had once kept me out, and smiled. Voiceover. They told me to go find a family, so I did. But I didn't find them, I built them. From systems, from chaos, from the belief that even broken things can still move. The security lights flickered as I straightened, watching the reflection of the Atlas Flow logo glow faintly on the suitcase tag. Voiceover. Justice isn't revenge, it's structure. It's when the flow finally makes sense, when every scar has a place in the system that runs right. I turned away from the gate, the sound of my footsteps blending with the steady hum of the automated conveyors inside. Somewhere in that rhythm, I heard the pulse of everything I'd fought for: every night shift, every spreadsheet, every lesson learned from pain. I paused once more and glanced over my shoulder. The suitcase sat beneath the rules board like a relic reclaimed, no longer a burden but a record. A part of the machine now. And with a quiet smile, I whispered the final thought that had carried me through every storm. Have you ever been told to make it on your own the day you graduated? Tell me where you're watching from, because you're not standing alone at that gate anymore.